Okay, let's jump right into this explainer by asking one of the most audacious, heavily debated questions out there. What is life really like for men? It's a question that sparks endless arguments, but it's rarely answered by someone who has genuinely crossed the gender divide to experience it firsthand. Today, we're breaking down an absolutely extraordinary journey that's going to challenge everything we think we know about gender dynamics, privilege, and the hidden struggles of half the population. To actually answer this, Los Angeles Times columnist Norah Vincent didn't just study men from afar. Nope, she spent 18 months living disguised as one. You see, Vincent was a self-described tomboy and a lesbian living in Manhattan, and she kept noticing that a lot of women around her were just totally convinced that men have always had it better, in every conceivable way. She really wanted to know if that assumption actually held up to reality, but she also knew that just handing out surveys to guys wasn't going to cut it. She had to see it for herself. And her motivation here is just fascinating. She wanted to move entirely beyond these established assumptions, to experience the raw, lived reality of the opposite sex. She didn't want to be a researcher walking around with a clipboard. She wanted to be a complete insider. She realized the only way to genuinely understand the male experience was to strip away her own identity and step fully into theirs. But making this happen, it was meticulous and honestly physically grueling. Transforming into her male alter ego, Ned, started with a harsh buzz cut to square off her jaw. She wore a tight sports bra to flatten her chest and literally hired a makeup artist to glue synthetic hair clippings to her face so she'd have a credible 5 o'clock shadow. And the craziest part? She underwent months of intense vocal training with a Juilliard coach to drop her natural nasal resonance and learn to speak entirely from the chest. For 18 whole months, she completely immersed herself in the male world. We're talking 150 separate times putting on Ned's whiskers and clothes. She had to adopt this hypervigilant mindset just to survive as an insider. This wasn't some quick weekend stunt, right? This was a year and a half of changing her diet to bulk up, totally altering her posture, and learning to walk, talk, and think like a man so she could seamlessly blend into spaces where women simply are not allowed. So, let's look at part 1 of her journey, entering the male world through a bowling league. Her first real test as Ned was joining an all-male bowling team in a working-class Pennsylvania neighborhood. Now, walking into those lanes, she was bracing herself for a really harsh, hyper-competitive, toxic environment. But what she actually found was this profound, unspoken warmth. A guy named Jim just welcomed her onto the team, no questions asked. She quickly figured out that the constant cussing and rough, good-natured ribbing, those were actually profound expressions of male affection and loyalty. It completely flipped her expectations upside down. But she didn't just stay at the bowling alley. Vincent infiltrated completely different environments to map out how human behavior shifts based on the space. She tracked these distinct archetypes, from the action-oriented loyalty of the bowling buddy to the desperate isolation of the strip club patron, all the way to the heavy shame felt in men's therapy groups. This gave her an incredible, comprehensive psychological profile of modern manhood across vastly different social spheres. Which brings us to part 2, where she uncovers some of the darker realities: clubs and dating. When Ned entered spaces centered around sex and romance, the pressure got immensely heavier. As a lesbian, she kind of assumed a strip club would be, well, enjoyable. But instead, she discovered a deeply, deeply uncomfortable atmosphere. It wasn't this triumphant celebration of male freedom at all. It was driven by intense objectification and isolation. She saw that guys were using these spaces just to escape the crushing pressures of their daily lives, revealing this profound loneliness that society almost never talks about. And then she tried dating women as a man. The dynamic shifted entirely. The women she met were often desperately hungry for love, but heavily guarded, and sometimes really bitter about past relationships. This exposed the absolutely crushing, near-impossible standards placed on men when it comes to dating. Women expected Ned to be this flawless provider and an unyielding protector. It was a high-stakes performance that made Vincent realize firsthand just how incredibly hard it is for men to ever let their guard down and be truly vulnerable. That leads right into part 3, what she calls the 3-note emotional range. Later in the experiment, she joins an Iron John-inspired men's therapy group. And there, she noticed that men are essentially restricted to playing just 3 emotional notes. Society allows them to show anger, pride, and amusement. That's pretty much it. The foundational human emotions, sadness, fear, vulnerability, are strictly denied. The men in these groups were absolutely starving for emotional connection, fighting so hard to reclaim the parts of their humanity that they've been forced to bury just to survive in a world demanding constant stoicism. Vincent found this thought that strikes right at the heart of everything she saw. Just take a second to really absorb this. The sweetness is pounded out of him. She concluded that the way society enforces masculinity requires this brutal, systematic suppression of a person's true self, starting from when they're just little kids. It's not a natural state of being, it's an imposed armor that completely cuts men off from tenderness and emotional freedom. And wearing that armor has a cost, which brings us to part 4, the psychological breakdown. You see, maintaining this rigid, macho facade wasn't just a cool sociology experiment anymore. It became a massive psychological burden for Vincent herself. The mental health toll of actually living the male experience pushed her right to the absolute brink. The constant deceit of living a double life, combined with the extreme emotional starvation required to act like a man, was just too much. She ended up suffering a severe nervous breakdown, which actually forced her to pull the plug on the 18-month experiment early. If you want proof of how toxic these expectations are, just look at what it did to someone who was only pretending. The climax of her entire journey boils down to one incredibly heartbreaking realization. She realized that most men are living in a disguise of their own. They're hiding immense pain, rage, and shame right beneath a tough exterior. That gruff front, the aggression, the stoicism, it's usually just a defense mechanism. It's an oversized suit of armor they wear to protect the highly vulnerable, insecure human underneath, who is just terrified of being exposed as inadequate. So what do we do with all this? Let's move to part 5, empathy and understanding. After the experiment finally concluded and she settled back into her own life, she realized her initial assumptions were completely shattered. The idea that men just inherently have it easier, it's fundamentally flawed. Now, yes, she definitely experienced male privilege. She felt way safer walking around at night, and she got a lot more immediate respect in professional settings. But she learned that this privilege is paid for with a devastating currency, intense emotional isolation, and the crushing pressure to always perform. Men are absolutely suffering. They're just doing it in completely different, largely silent ways. When we distill this massive undertaking down, a few perspective-shifting takeaways really stand out. These rigid codes of masculinity deeply restrict the human experience for guys. We also have to recognize that men have their own totally valid ways of nurturing. It's often shown through action and silent loyalty rather than talking it out. Ultimately, Vincent teaches us that true empathy is a verb. It demands that we actively look past that protective armor to see the shared humanity underneath. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. If this incredible journey taught us anything, it's that the silence and stoicism of men are very often just masking a deep, desperate need for connection. And knowing that, it kind of demands a change in how we relate to each other, doesn't it? Choosing to cross that divide, to offer real sympathy, and to create spaces for vulnerability, that is the very first step toward a much more empathetic world. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions, and definitely keep looking beyond the surface.